The moment Eudora Carver stepped off the stagecoach in Ridgeline, Texas, a rattlesnake coiled itself in the middle of the dusty Main Street, and every man within 50 yards took 3 steps back. Every man except one. The year was 1874, and the town of Ridgeline sat at the edge of the Texas hill country like a stubborn splinter under the skin of the frontier, too small to appear on most maps but too proud to disappear from the earth. Red dust hung in the summer air like a curtain that never quite closed, and the heat pressed down on everything with a kind of holy violence that made even the horses look philosophical. Eudora had traveled 3 days from San Antonio with nothing but a leather trunk, a carpetbag stuffed with her father's medical journals, and a deed to a piece of land that most people in Ridgeline believed rightfully belonged to someone else. She stood at the edge of the street watching the snake with absolute stillness, her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed traveling hat, her green eyes calm in a way that unsettled people who expected women arriving alone in frontier towns to be either terrified or desperate. She was neither. She was 24 years old, recently widowed after barely 6 months of a marriage. She had entered out of obligation rather than love, and she had ridden 3 days in a hot wooden box to claim land that her late husband had left her. Land she intended to build something real upon. The man who did not step back was Timothy Keller. He came from the opposite end of the street at a steady walk, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step, his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that came from actual labor rather than vanity, with a jaw that looked like it had been squared off with a carpenter's tool and brown eyes that held the particular quality of someone who had seen hard things and chosen to remain decent anyway. He was a cattle rancher who operated a modest spread 3 miles east of town, known for his fairness with his hands, his reliability in a drought, and his general unwillingness to involve himself in other people's drama. He crouched down about 6 feet from the rattlesnake, tilted his head, studied the creature with the same careful attention he gave to most things, and then he picked up a long stick that had been lying in the road and gently guided the snake toward the gap between the general store and the harness shop, letting it go into the shadow without harm. Then he stood, looked up, and found Eudora Carver watching him with those green eyes. He touched the brim of his hat. She gave him a single nod of acknowledgement. That was all. He walked past her and into the general store, and she picked up her carpetbag and walked toward the hotel, and neither of them thought that particular moment would matter much. They were both wrong. Eudora settled into the single room the Ridgeline Hotel offered its female guests, a sparse and honest little space with an iron bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the back alley where chickens roamed freely, and a hook on the back of the door that she immediately used for her hat. She spread her late husband's deed across the thin blanket and studied it in the failing afternoon light. Clarence Carver had purchased 200 acres east of town 14 months before his death from a fever that had been swifter and more absolute than anyone expected. The land had a creek running through the southern edge, a stand of live oaks in the northwest corner, and a half-built barn that his foreman, a man named Jasper Holt, had reportedly been squatting on for the better part of 6 months. Jasper Holt was the reason she had arrived with a degree of caution. Clarence's letters, before he died, had mentioned that Holt was a man who felt entitled to things that weren't his. And she had been told, by the lawyer in San Antonio who handled the estate, that Holt had been circulating a story in Ridgeline that Clarence had verbally promised him the land before the fever took him. There was no written record of any such promise. The deed was clear and legal, but a woman arriving alone to enforce a property claim in a Texas frontier town in the summer of 1874 was going to need more than a legal document. She was going to need the kind of social standing that took time to build. She ate supper that evening in the hotel's small dining room, a simple meal of biscuits and salt pork that she consumed with careful dignity, and she listened to the conversations around her the way her father had taught her to listen to a patient's breathing, quietly, with full attention, learning what the sounds told you that the words did not. She heard the name Timothy Keller 3 times before she finished her meal. Once from the hotel owner's wife, who mentioned him in the context of a water dispute that had been resolved fairly the previous spring. Once from a traveling dry goods salesman who said Keller had bought his entire stock of seed corn at an honest price when everyone else in the county was trying to negotiate down. And once from a rough-looking man at the corner table who said, without apparent malice, that Keller was too good for his own good and would get himself killed one day because of it. She filed all 3 observations away carefully. The next morning, Eudora rose before the sun and dressed with her usual precise economy, ate a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, and then walked to the land office to introduce herself to the county registrar, a thin man named Aldous Webb who wore spectacles and a permanent expression of mild distress. She presented her deed. She presented her marriage certificate. She presented her husband's death record. She was polite and unhurried, and she answered every question he raised with the quiet authority of someone who had anticipated every obstacle. Webb recorded her claim. He looked uncomfortable doing it, which told her something about whose side he was likely on if things became contentious, but he did it, because the documents were correct, and he was not quite dishonest enough to refuse them outright. She thanked him, left the land office, and walked directly into Timothy Keller, who was standing outside with a rolled piece of paper in his hand and an expression that suggested he was waiting for the same office. "Mrs. Carver," he said, which surprised her because she had not given her name to anyone except the hotel register. "You know my name," she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation. "Small town," he said. "And Aldous talks more than he thinks he does." He paused. "I'm Timothy Keller. I run cattle east of town." "I know," she said. "You moved the snake." Something shifted in his expression, a slight softening, almost imperceptible. "Didn't see any reason to kill it." "Neither did I," she said. "We agree on something already." He smiled at that, a brief and genuine thing that reorganized his face in a way she hadn't expected, and that she found herself studying for a half-second longer than was strictly necessary. Then she excused herself and walked on, and he watched her go with the particular attentiveness of a man who doesn't yet understand what he's looking at but knows it's important. Eudora hired a buggy that afternoon and drove out to her property. The road east of Ridgeline ran between stands of cedar and mesquite, and the hill country air carried the smell of dry grass and something distant and sweet that she couldn't name. She found the creek first, a cheerful and useful strip of clear water that ran through a limestone channel, and then she found the stand of live oaks, and then she found the half-built barn. Jasper Holt was standing in front of it. He was a wide man in his late 40s, heavy through the chest and shoulders, with a beard that had gone gray in patches, and a way of standing that was meant to communicate ownership of the space he occupied. He had 2 other men with him, cowhands by their appearance, who were sitting on a fence rail in the manner of men who had been told to look present without doing anything in particular. "You'd be the widow," Holt said. "I'd be Eudora Carver," she replied, stepping down from the buggy without assistance. "And this is my land." He looked at her the way certain men look at legal documents, as though the existence of something written down is a personal affront that doesn't change the practical truth of things. "Clarence told me this place was mine when he passed. Clarence's deed says otherwise," she said. "I've registered it this morning with the county." "Aldous Webb is a paper pusher," Holt said. "Paper doesn't mean much out here." "Perhaps not to you," she said, "but it means something to the law." Holt stepped forward. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. But there was a particular kind of pressure in his movement that was meant to communicate what his words hadn't quite said directly, and Eudora held her ground in the way that women learn to hold ground when they have no choice but to do so. "You ought to think carefully about what you're walking into, ma'am," he said. "I've thought about very little else for several weeks," she told him. "I'll be back tomorrow with a proper survey. I'd appreciate it if you and your men had moved your belongings off the property by then." She climbed back into the buggy, turned it around with a precision that suggested she was significantly better with horses than she had any reason to demonstrate, and drove back toward town. Her hands were perfectly steady on the reins. Her heart was moving at approximately twice its normal rate. That evening, she sat in the hotel's small parlor writing a letter to the sheriff in the county seat, describing the encounter in careful and precise language. She was halfway through the second paragraph when Timothy Keller came through the front door of the hotel, saw her at the writing table, and stopped. "I heard you went out to the Carver land today," he said. She looked up. "Word travels." "Holt talks more than he thinks he does, too," he said. He stood with his hat in his hands, a gesture of consideration that she noticed. "He's not a dangerous man precisely, but he's stubborn in a way that gets dangerous." "I gathered that," she said. "Do you have someone helping you with this claim?" She was quiet for a moment. "I was planning to manage it myself." He looked at her for a long beat. Outside, the main street of Ridgeline settled into its evening quiet, a piano starting up somewhere distant, a horse nickering, the last orange light going out of the sky with a kind of sad generosity. "I have land that borders yours on the north side," he said. "Holt has been encroaching on my fence line for 2 years. I've been dealing with it through patience, which hasn't been working." He paused. "I'm not suggesting anything other than that we might have a practical reason to be allies in this." She studied him. He met her gaze without flinching. She was a good judge of people, trained first by her father, who had been a physician, and later by a short marriage to a man who had turned out to be considerably different from what he presented. She read Timothy Keller carefully and found, with some surprise, that she trusted what she read. "That seems sensible," she said. He nodded. "I'll ride out with you tomorrow when you do the survey. As a neighbor, nothing more than that." "I'll be at the livery at 7, she said. He put his hat back on, touched the brim, and left. She sat for a moment looking at the door he had gone through, then returned to her letter to the sheriff with a somewhat lighter feeling than she'd had before. The survey the next morning was carried out by a quiet and extremely thorough man named Mr. Forsyth, who had been sent down from the county seat, and who had a chain and a transit, and a complete indifference to Jasper Holt's visible displeasure. Holt was present with his 2 men again, and he watched the proceedings from the shade of the half-built barn with the look of someone calculating whether the investment of a confrontation was worth the return. Timothy rode easy on a gray horse beside Eudora, who drove the buggy, and the 2 of them spoke little during the survey itself, but spoke carefully between the measured distances. He told her about the hill country's water patterns, which creeks ran dry in August and which ran year-round, which limestone formations meant good well digging, and which were solid rock down to uselessness. She told him about her plans for the land, a working farm rather than a cattle operation, vegetables and grain and perhaps some chickens, possibly a kitchen garden that could supply the hotel and the 2 restaurants in town if she could get the soil producing correctly. He listened to her plans with the genuine attention of someone who found them interesting rather than impractical, and when he asked questions they were specific and constructive, about growing seasons and soil depth, and whether she had any experience with irrigation, which she did, having grown up on a farm outside Austin before her father moved them to San Antonio. "Your father was a doctor," Timothy said at one point. It wasn't quite a question. He died when I was 20. I kept his journals." She paused. "I can read a medical text fairly well enough to be useful at least. There's no doctor in Ridgeline, I noticed." "There isn't," he said. "Nearest one's in Fredericksburg." "That's a long way when something's wrong," she said. "It is," he agreed, and she could hear something careful in his voice, something that told her that distance to a doctor had mattered to him at some point in a way he wasn't going to explain right now. By mid-morning the survey was complete. Mr. Forsyth departed with his chain and his transit, leaving a set of careful notations that he would file formally with the county. Holt stared at the departing buggy for a long moment, then looked at Timothy across the property line with an expression that was difficult to read, but that Timothy seemed to understand well enough. He nodded at Holt in a manner that was neither threatening nor concessive, a kind of flat acknowledgement, and then he rode back toward town alongside Eudora's buggy. "He'll try something else," Timothy said. "I know," she said, "but now he knows the boundaries are recorded." "Recording them and enforcing them aren't the same thing," he said. "Not out here." She looked at him. "What do you suggest?" He turned the gray horse slightly so he could look at her directly. "I suggest you build something on that land as quickly as possible. A structure, a garden, a well. Presence is its own kind of argument, and I suggest you introduce yourself to the town properly. Come to church Sunday if you're inclined. Come to the social at the Methodist Hall next week. Let people know who you are." "You sound like you've thought about this," she said. "I've been managing my own place alone for 6 years," he said. "You learn to think ahead." He paused briefly. "And I know how Holt operates. He needs people to believe he has the upper hand before he moves. Take that away from him." She was quiet for a moment. The buggy rolled through a stretch of cedar shade, and the air was briefly cool and smelled of something green and living. "You've been very helpful to someone you barely know," she said. He was quiet for a beat longer than she expected. "My mother came west alone after my father died," he said. "She made a go of it. Took a lot of people being decent to her when they could have been otherwise. I suppose I have some residual interest in the concept." He said it plainly without sentimentality, but the plainness of it made it hit harder, and Eudora felt something shift slightly in her chest, a small but distinct movement, like a door opening in a room she hadn't known was locked. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me that." He nodded and rode on ahead to open the gate at the edge of her property, holding it while she drove through, and they came back into town together in the midday heat, two people who were already beginning to mean something to each other without having put any words to it yet. The following week carried its own rhythm. Eudora threw herself into building a life in Ridgeline with the efficient and methodical energy that had characterized everything she had done since deciding, 3 weeks after Clarence's funeral, that she was going to use what he had left her to make something entirely her own. She hired 2 men from town, a young Mexican hand named Raphael, who was quick and willing, and had a gift for understanding what she wanted before she fully explained it, and an older German immigrant named Ernst who had been farming in the hill country for 20 years, and who looked at her plans for the soil with the expression of a craftsman examining a promising piece of wood. They broke ground on a kitchen garden and began digging the well she needed in the first week. They started framing out the main house in the second. The half-built barn, which Holt had vacated with obvious resentment, she decided to complete properly before the summer ended, because the barn was the most urgent structure and it was already half done. She went to church on the Sunday after her arrival, wearing her better dress and her good hat, and she sat in the 3rd row and sang the hymns with a clear and steady voice. And afterward she introduced herself to the congregation with a direct simplicity that people in small towns either respected or distrusted immediately. Most of them, she was relieved to find, respected it. She met the minister's wife, a generous and sharp-eyed woman named Martha Pryor, who invited her to the social and who looked at her with the kind of frank appraisal that women in frontier communities gave other women when they were trying to determine whether they were an asset or a liability. Within 20 minutes, Martha had concluded she was an asset and had taken it upon herself to introduce Eudora to approximately half the town. Timothy was at the church that Sunday. He sat in the 2nd row from the back, which she suspected was habitual rather than modest, because it had the quality of a man who wanted to see everything without being at the center of it. He nodded to her when they filed out. She nodded back. The minister's wife, who missed nothing, observed this exchange with visible interest. At the social the following Wednesday evening, held in the Methodist's hall with its paper lanterns and its tables of donated food and its fiddle player who knew 7 songs, and played them in an order that never varied, Timothy asked her to dance. He asked carefully, the way he seemed to do everything, with a kind of deliberateness that suggested he had thought about whether to ask before he asked. She said yes, because she wanted to, and because there was nothing in the world wrong with a widow dancing with a neighbor at a community social. They danced a Virginia reel with the easy energy of two people who were both competent enough at it to concentrate on the conversation rather than the steps. He asked about her progress on the well. She told him Ernst believed they would hit water within another 3 feet. He told her that a spring 2 miles north of her property suggested the water table in her area was good. She asked him how his cattle were faring in the heat. He said better than expected because the creek had stayed up. And then the fiddle shifted tempo, and the reel became a slower thing, a waltz that the fiddle player had apparently decided to introduce without warning. And suddenly, they were standing much closer together than the Virginia reel required, and the hall around them was warm and bright and smelling of beeswax and dried flowers, and the particular sweetness of summer in the hill country. He was a good dancer. She hadn't expected that. He moved with a quiet confidence, his hand warm at the small of her back through the fabric of her dress, and she found herself more aware of the specific weight of that hand than she had been aware of any touch in a very long time. "You're a good dancer," she said, because it was true, and because saying it was easier than saying what she was actually thinking. "My mother insisted," he said. "She said no one trusted a man who couldn't dance. She sounds like a sensible woman." "She was," he said, and the tense hit her quietly. Past, she didn't press it. They danced through the full length of the waltz and then stepped apart with the natural ease of two people who are aware they have been standing close and are choosing to be thoughtful about it. He brought her a glass of lemonade. She thanked him. They stood side by side watching the other dancers and talking about small, useful things. The hardware store in Fredericksburg, where she could get nails and glass at a reasonable price. The traveling preacher who came through in October and could perform whatever legal ceremonies the town needed in a single visit. The peculiarities of the wind in the hill country that made late summer afternoons cooler than you'd expect. By the time the social wound down and the paper lantern started guttering, something had changed between them, slightly but irrevocably, the way a creek changes its course after a heavy rain. The geography is technically the same, but the water has found a new way through. Jasper Holt made his second move on a Thursday morning 10 days after the survey. He came while Raphael and Ernst were working on the house frame, and Eudora was in the kitchen garden with her sleeves rolled up, marking out the rows for her fall planting by reference to an agricultural guide she had brought from San Antonio. And he came with 3 men this time rather than 2, and the additional body was meant to communicate something about the seriousness of his intentions. He told her that he had found a witness who would testify that Clarence had promised him the land verbally. He named a man in town, a drinker named Cooley who owed Holt money. He told her that he had spoken to a lawyer who believed the verbal promise could be argued in court. He told her all of this in a voice that was measured and almost polite, which was in some ways more unsettling than open aggression would have been. Eudora set down her guide and straightened and looked at him with the specific quality of attention she had developed over years of being underestimated. "A verbal promise from a man with no witnesses against a signed and filed deed," she said. "I'll be happy to let a court decide." Holt's expression didn't change. "Courts cost money," he said. "They do," she agreed. "So does taking me to court when I have a signed deed and you have a drunk man's testimony." He studied her for a moment. One of his men shifted his weight, and Raphael, who had been watching from the house frame, climbed down from the scaffolding with a careful and unhurried movement that placed him about 20 feet closer to the confrontation. Ernst, who was 70 years old and built like a cabinet, set down his hammer with the deliberateness of a man making a point. Holt looked at the 2 men, then back at Eudora. "This isn't over," he said. "I never said it was," she replied. "But it won't end the way you want it to." He left. She watched him go, then turned back to her rows and marked 2 more stakes before she allowed herself to breathe fully. Then she walked to the well site and sat on the edge of it for a moment with her hands in her lap, looking at the sky, which was the deep true blue of a Texas August afternoon, and she let herself feel the fear she hadn't shown and let it pass through her, and then she stood up and went back to work. She told Timothy about it that evening. He had stopped by with the ostensible purpose of checking where her north fence line would run, since it bordered his property, but she suspected he had also been watching the Holt situation with some attention. They sat on the tailgate of the wagon she had acquired from the livery. She still hadn't built a proper porch. That was 2 weeks away, and she told him what had happened in the quiet and precise way she had of recounting events. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The evening was making the sky extraordinary, layered orange and pink and something deeper going to purple at the horizon. "The lawyer in the county seat is named Porter," he said at last. "He's honest and he's not expensive. I think you should write to him directly and get out ahead of this in case Holt actually follows through." "I was already thinking the same thing," she said. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to give you the name." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the sunset, his hands loose on the wagon's edge, his hat on the boards beside him. There was something very settled about him. She had noticed over these weeks, not stagnant but settled, the way a good house is settled into its foundation, with a weight that comes from being built right rather than being heavy. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He looked at her. "You can ask." "Why are you still alone? You're 30 years old, you have a good spread, you're clearly," she paused, choosing her words with some care, "you're clearly the kind of man women in a small town pay attention to. Why haven't you married?" He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had overstepped. Then he said, "I was engaged once, about 4 years ago. Woman named Claire. She caught typhoid that winter and she was gone in 2 weeks." He said it without particular drama, which somehow made it more present. "After that I was busy for a while, and then I suppose I was careful." "I understand being careful," she said softly. "I imagine you do," he said. And then after another pause, "What about you? If you don't mind my asking." She considered. "My husband was a good man," she said. "He was kind and he meant well, but we were practical about it more than anything else. He needed a capable wife for his land and his business. My father's practice had debts when he died and I needed security. We understood each other, but it wasn't," she stopped. "It wasn't the kind of love that breaks you open." Timothy looked at her for a long moment. "Do you want that kind?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. She held his gaze. "I think I'm starting to think I might," she said. The night came down around them with its enormous stars, and neither of them said anything more for a while. But the air between them was different, charged and soft at once, like the moment before a storm breaks and the whole world goes still and bright. He left late that night and she watched the gray horse carry him down the road toward his own spread, and she went inside to her tent. She was sleeping in a canvas tent on her own property now, proudly, stubbornly, and she lay on her cot under a sky that was burning with stars, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was unmistakably hope. The weeks that followed had the quality of water finding its own level, natural and steady, and inevitable in ways that neither of them acknowledged out loud, even as they both felt it happening. Timothy came by her property 3 or 4 times a week, always with a practical justification, always with something useful to offer. An extra length of lumber he had acquired, a recommendation for a blacksmith who could forge her well's iron cap at a fair price, a book about soil management for hill country agriculture that he had ordered from a catalog in San Antonio, and that he placed on her newly completed front porch railing with the studied casualness of a man pretending not to make a gesture. She read the book in 3 days and left it on his fence post when she rode past his property, with a note inside the front cover that said only, "The chapter on limestone soils was the most useful thing I have read in 2 years. Thank you." He found the note and read it again, and then put the book inside his house with the note still in it. Her house was finished by late August. A single-story structure of local limestone and timber with a real porch and a kitchen that was, she told Ernst with genuine feeling, the finest room she had ever owned. Ernst received this compliment with the expression of a craftsman who had known all along that it was good work, and was simply waiting for the acknowledgement. Raphael helped her move her things from the tent into the house on a bright Saturday morning, and when he was done, she paid him and Ernst both a bonus that surprised them. And then she stood alone in her kitchen with its new iron stove and its 2 east-facing windows, and the creak just audible through the open back door. And she felt the first full breath of something she recognized as belonging. The Holt situation resolved in a way that was almost anticlimactic after all the tension that had preceded it. The lawyer Porter wrote a letter to Holt's so-called attorney, outlining the legal weakness of a verbal promise argument against a filed deed with clean documentation, and calculating the rough cost of the proceedings Holt would be inviting. Cooley, when it became clear that the case was not a sure thing, quietly declined to provide testimony. Holt came to see Eudora one more time in early September. He stood on her new porch with his hat in his hands, which was different from the last time, and he said, "I don't agree that Clarence meant what that deed says, but I'm not a man who throws good money after bad." "That seems wise," she said, from the other side of the screen door she had recently installed. He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite respect but was not hostility either, more of a territorial animal acknowledging a boundary it had decided was not worth crossing. "You've got grit," he said. "I'll give you that." "I'll take it," she said. He left. She never had a direct confrontation with him again. That evening, she walked over to Timothy's property for the first time, rather than waiting for him to come to her. She knocked on the door of his house, a solidly built place of timber and stone that had the character of a man who had been building and adjusting it for years, adding rooms and features not all at once but steadily, as need and means arose. He opened the door, and the expression on his face when he saw her was unguarded in a way that made her chest tighten pleasantly. "Holt came this morning," she said. He stood down. Timothy exhaled slowly. "Good," he said. Then he held the door open. "Come in." "I was just making coffee." She stepped inside his house for the first time and looked around it with the attention she gave to everything. It was a lived-in space, not untidy but dense with the particular accumulation of a person who was interested in many things. A shelf of books that were clearly read rather than decorative. A drafting table covered with what looked like fence diagrams and grazing plans. A set of geological survey maps pinned to one wall with care. A jacket hung on a chair near the fire. A cast-iron pot that was doing something good and quiet on the stove. "You read a great deal," she said, looking at the shelves. "Winter is long out here," he said, bringing her a coffee cup. She took it and looked at the titles. History, Natural Science, a volume of Shakespeare, 2 agricultural guides, a medical text that surprised her until it didn't. She pulled the medical text from the shelf. It was one her father had owned. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Mail order from a bookseller in St. Louis," he said, "couple of years ago." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Claire," he said. "When she got sick, I didn't know enough. I wanted to know more in case—" He stopped. "In case there was ever another time." She stood holding the book for a moment, then set it back gently. She understood that particular impulse completely, the wish to be better armed against a world that could take people without warning. "Father," she said, "after he died, I spent a year reading everything he had left. It was partly grief and partly the same thing you're describing." They stood on opposite sides of his kitchen table looking at each other over their coffee cups, and the quality of the look was the kind that has a whole conversation in it without any words. "Eudora," he said, her name in his mouth for the first time without any qualifier or formality, just her name, and it sounded like something decided. "Yes," she said. Which was not an answer to anything he had said. It was an answer to what he hadn't yet said but was about to. He walked around the table and stood close to her, and she looked up at him, and he took her coffee cup out of her hand and set it on the table, and then he kissed her, carefully at first and then not carefully at all. And it was the kind of kiss that opens things up, that breaks down careful interior walls that have been standing too long, and she had her hands in his hair, and she was crying a little, which surprised her completely, and he was holding her with both arms and his hands were shaking slightly. And the iron pot on the stove went on doing its quiet work, and outside the hill country night was thick with stars, and the sound of the creek that ran between their two properties like a sentence connecting two words it had always meant to connect. They stood in his kitchen holding each other for a long time without talking. There was a great deal to say, and none of it needed to be said right then. It was enough, for now, to have arrived at this place. She left after midnight and rode the short distance back to her own property under the full moon, and she sat on her new porch for a while before going inside, listening to the creek and the insects and the vast quiet of the country, feeling her heart doing things in her chest that she hadn't felt it do in years. She wrote to her cousin in San Antonio that night by lamplight. "I think something is happening to me here. I will write more when I understand it better." October arrived and brought with it the particular beauty of the hill country autumn, the cedar staying green but the maples and the cypress turning, the air losing its violence and becoming something you wanted to stay inside of, crisp and full of the smell of live oak and wood smoke and the good productive smell of harvested earth. Eudora's kitchen garden had come in better than she had dared hope, producing quantities of beans and squash, and tomatoes that she sold at the Saturday market, and that earned her the admiring attention of several families who had been skeptical about a woman farming alone. She had also, quietly, without advertising it, begun using her father's medical journals in practical ways. When the blacksmith's apprentice cut himself badly on a piece of iron, and the nearest doctor was in Fredericksburg, she cleaned and sutured the wound with steady hands, and a knowledge that she had absorbed through a decade of reading. When a child in town developed the rash and fever that she recognized from her father's notes as scarlet fever, she advised the family on the care and isolation that would give the child the best chance, and the child recovered. The minister's wife Martha told people about it and people remembered, and by October there were a small number of families in Ridgeline who had started coming to Eudora quietly with questions she answered from her father's knowledge and her own plain good sense. She was careful about it. She did not call herself a doctor. She did not charge for it. But she was there, and she knew things, and the town was small and the need was real. Timothy watched all of this with the steady, warm attention of a man who is falling in love and knows it, and has decided not to resist. He came to the Saturday market and bought beans he didn't need. He came to supper at her house twice a week. She was a good cook, better than she let on, because cooking had been one of the things she could control during the years when she had controlled very little. He helped her build the fence on the north property line, working beside Raphael on the post holes, while Eudora brought water and made sandwiches from bread she had baked that morning, and the three of them ate lunch in the shade of the live oaks and talked about the weather and the price of cattle and the political situation in Austin, which was contentious in ways that all three of them were paying attention to. He told her about the cattle business, about the drives he had done when he was younger, about the changes coming to ranching now that the railheads were closer, and you didn't have to push a herd all the way to Kansas if you managed things carefully. She told him about San Antonio, about her father's practice, about the patients she had watched him treat, and the things she had learned without meaning to learn them. They told each other the things you tell a person when you are building the architecture of a shared life, brick by careful brick, testing each piece as you place it. He was gentle with her in ways that were distinct from the gentleness of courtesy. He noticed things when she was tired, when something was troubling her, when she needed practical help versus when she needed to be left alone to solve something herself. He knew the difference, which was not a small thing, and he applied that knowledge with the same care he applied to everything. One evening in late October, he came by the house and found her at the kitchen table with her father's medical journals spread out around her. working through a passage about treating infection with the focused expression he recognized as the one she wore when she was solving a problem rather than just reading. He sat down across from her without interrupting, and she looked up after a few minutes and said, "Ernst thinks he may have broken a rib. He says it's been hurting him for 2 weeks." Timothy looked at the journal page she had opened. "What does your father's book say? That if it's a simple fracture, he needs rest and tight wrapping. If it's displaced, he needs a real doctor." She paused. "I think it's a simple one. He's breathing all right, and there's no discoloration suggesting anything deeper." "Then you can help him." "I'm not a doctor," she said. "No," he said. "But you know what you're doing, and the nearest actual doctor is 20 miles away on a road Ernst can't ride comfortably right now." He met her eyes. "This town is lucky you're in it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You always seem to see me as more capable than most people do," she said. "I see you as exactly as capable as you are," he said, "which is considerable." She felt the color rise in her face, and she looked back at her journal to avoid letting him see it, which he saw anyway, and he was very careful not to smile where she could notice. She wrapped Ernst's rib the next morning and gave him strict instructions about rest, which he received with the expression of a man who had no intention of following them but had enough respect for her to pretend otherwise. He was better within the week. November settled in with a cold, clear quality, the skies going that deep winter blue that is specific to Texas high country, and it was in the first week of November that Timothy came to her porch in the evening after supper and asked her to sit with him for a moment. She sat down beside him on the porch steps, and the night was cold enough that their breath showed, and the stars were absolutely brilliant in the way that cold nights make them. He had his hat in his hands, and he was doing the thing with it that she had come to recognize as what he did when he was working up to something that mattered. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I've been thinking about how to say it in a way that's worthy of it, and I've decided there isn't a way, so I'm just going to say it." He looked at her. "I love you. I've been trying not to rush this because you've been through things that deserve time, and you've been building something here that is completely and entirely yours, and I didn't want you to think I was trying to step into any part of that. But I love you, Eudora, and I want to build my life alongside yours if you'll let me." The stars were very bright. The creek was saying its usual thing in the darkness. "Timothy," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "I have been in love with you since October at the very latest, and probably before that if I'm honest." She paused. "I've been trying not to move too fast as well. I'm new here. I'm still becoming what I came here to become." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to become anything different. I'm asking to be here while you do." She put her hand over his where it was holding the hat, and his fingers turned under hers and held on. "Yes," she said, which had been her answer to him before and was her answer again now. "Yes." He kissed her in the cold air on the porch steps, and the whole of the hill country winter settled around them with its particular tenderness. The traveling preacher came through Ridgeline in November, which was a month earlier than Timothy had anticipated, and the entire town made of the wedding a greater occasion than either of them had planned. Martha Pryor took the matter in hand with the energy of someone who had been waiting for it, and organized flowers and food, and the decoration of the little church with a thorough joy that was touching and slightly overwhelming. Eudora wore her best dress, which was a deep green that set off her eyes in a way that made Timothy, when he first saw her walking down the aisle on Raphael's arm, because she had asked him, and he had accepted with a formal dignity that moved several people in the church look at her, with an expression so full and plain that several women in the congregation got quietly emotional about it. She walked toward him, and he held out his hand, and she took it, and the preacher spoke the words that the frontier had always used to make these things legal and true, and Timothy said his vows in a low, steady voice that she felt all the way through, and she said hers clearly and without wavering. And when he kissed her, the church made the sound that churches make when everyone in them is genuinely happy. They walked out into the November sunlight as Mr. and Mrs. Keller, and the town celebrated them with a generosity that small communities are capable of when they have decided to love someone. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that even while you are inside it, is one of the good ones. They merged their households in the practical sense. He kept his cattle spread, she kept her farm, and the two properties were connected now by the fact of them, and by the fence they had built together, and also by a path through the cedars that they had worn down simply by walking back and forth so often that the earth itself had decided to make a road of it. She continued her quiet medical work in the town, growing more confident in it as the months went by, and her accumulated experience built upon her father's knowledge. In February, she assisted at a difficult birth that without her presence would have gone very badly, and afterward the mother named the baby girl Eudora, which made her sit down on the porch of the Keller house and cry with a feeling that was too large to contain standing up. Timothy found her there and sat down beside her, and didn't ask what was wrong because he could see that nothing was wrong. It was the particular weeping that comes from something going right in a way so full it overflows. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat in the cold February air until she was finished, and then she wiped her face and said, "Someone named their baby after me." "I heard," he said. "Half the town heard, actually." She laughed, which was the other side of the feeling, and then she kissed him and went inside to make coffee, and the ordinary evening went on in the most extraordinary way. Spring brought new calves to his herd and new planting to her farm, and also the discovery, made on a bright March morning with the bluebonnets just coming out along the road, that she was going to have a baby. She told him that evening with a kind of restrained excitement that was her particular way of expressing the things that moved her most, and he received it with both hands, literally. He took her hands in both of his and held them and said nothing for a full 10 seconds, and then he said, "Are you all right?" "I'm very well," she said, knowing he meant the practical question as well as the emotional one. "Good," he said, and then, "I'm so happy I don't know what to do with myself." "I suggest you finish the fence on the south pasture," she said. "Being useful always helps." He laughed, a full and genuine laugh that she loved, that she had worked to produce in the early days just to see what it looked like and had since grown addicted to. And then he picked her up, and she shrieked with a surprise and joy that she would have considered undignified 2 years earlier, and that now felt like the rightest thing in the world. The pregnancy was good. She was healthy and practical about it, reading everything her father had written about the subject, and corresponding with a physician in San Antonio who had been a colleague of her father's, and who wrote back with helpful and detailed advice. Timothy was attentive in a way that balanced care and respect expertly. He helped with the things she asked him to help with, and did not treat her as fragile in the ways she found patronizing, because he had been paying attention to exactly who she was for long enough to know the difference. She kept working through most of the summer lighter work, modified work, but work. Her kitchen garden was in its second year, and the soil was beginning to respond to her management with the productivity that she had been building toward, and she wasn't going to abandon it. She also kept attending to the town's medical needs, though with more selectivity as the summer wore on and the pregnancy advanced. Raphael, who had become indispensable, and whom she paid well and treated fairly, took on more of the heavy farm work that summer with a reliability that was exactly what she had hoped for when she hired him. He had brought his mother and younger sister to Ridgeline the previous autumn, and they had become part of the small community of people who formed the essential social fabric of Eudora's life here. She was conscious of how the land they lived on had been, not many generations before, Apache and Comanche territory. The hill country had known a great deal of violence and displacement in its recent history, violence that was still living in the landscape, and in the people whose ancestors had walked it longer than any fence or deed could claim. She thought about this with some regularity and with the uncomfortable honesty it deserved, and she treated the people around her, whatever their background, with a respect that came from genuine conviction rather than performance. The baby came in November, almost exactly on his first anniversary. A boy, arriving with the practical promptness of someone who had made a decision and was executing on it. He came in the night, with Martha Pryor and the experienced midwife from town in attendance, and Timothy sat outside the bedroom door in the way of expectant fathers with his hat in his hands, and the whole of his anxiety working silently through his jaw. And when the baby cried, the first clear definite announcement of a new person entering the world, he closed his eyes for a moment with an expression that was something beyond relief, something that had no word. Eudora lay with the baby on her chest and said, "Come and see him." He came through the door and stood at the bedside and looked at his son with the expression of a man encountering something he had not known he was capable of feeling until it arrived. The baby was red-faced and absolutely certain of his opinions, which he expressed loudly for several minutes before settling. "He's stubborn," Timothy said. "Of course he is," Eudora said. "Look who his parents are." They named him John for Timothy's father, with the middle name of James for hers. John Carver Keller came into the world in November of 1875 and was received by the entire town of Ridgeline with the warmth that frontier communities give to new children, which is the warmth of a people who understand acutely that the future is a thing you make by showing up and staying. The years that followed in Ridgeline had the rich density of a life that is going right not because it is easy, but because the people in it are committed to making it good. The town grew incrementally. A new mercantile, a second restaurant, a schoolhouse that was completed in 1877, and for which Eudora served on the building committee with an organizational energy that left the other members slightly breathless. The schoolteacher who arrived to fill the position was a young woman from Ohio named Clara Hinds, 22 years old with spectacles and a fierce intelligence and a healthy skepticism about the Texas heat, who became one of Eudora's closest friends within the year. Timothy's cattle operation grew steadily, benefiting from his foresight about the changing railroad access to the South, and his habit of making decisions based on careful thought rather than fashion. He added a second hand to his crew, a young man named William who was 17 when he arrived asking for work, and whom Timothy hired after looking him over for 30 seconds and saying simply, "Can you be here at 4 in the morning?" William said yes and was there at 10 to 4, and the question was settled. Eudora's farm continued to be the productive thing she had envisioned, and her medical practice, for it had become, in practical terms, a practice, though she maintained scrupulously that she was not a doctor, became woven into the fabric of the town. There was discussion in 1877, during a town meeting about community needs, of whether someone ought to formally approach the county about getting a proper physician for Ridgeline. The discussion was reasonable, and she supported it. And at the end of it 3 people independently said some version of, "But Eudora is already here." And the meeting concluded with a decision to write to the county, and also to formally acknowledge that Eudora Keller's service to the health of the community deserved recognition. The recognition came in the form of a small stipend from the town council, and a room in the new mercantile building that was set aside for her use when she needed to see patients in a proper setting. She accepted both with the quiet satisfaction of something long earned arriving in the correct form. She and Timothy were good together in the deep way that comes from 2 people having chosen each other with their eyes open. They disagreed sometimes. She was more impatient with inefficiency than he was. He was more cautious than she was about certain kinds of change. And they disagreed with the productive directness of 2 people who respect each other enough to say what they actually think. They made up afterward in ways that were specific to them, that had developed from the particular chemistry of who they were and what they meant to each other, and the making up was always worth the disagreement. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1878, a girl this time, born with dark hair and green eyes that were so clearly her mother's that the midwife laughed when she saw them. They named her Ruth, for the biblical figure who travels into uncertain territory and makes her place there through loyalty and love, which seemed appropriate for a daughter born in the hill country to a woman who had done exactly that. John, who was 2.5 when Ruth arrived and therefore at the particular age of maximum opinion about everything, studied his new sister for a long moment and then told his mother that she was small. Eudora agreed that she was currently small, yes. John considered this, apparently found it acceptable, and went outside to tell his father about it. Timothy received the news of his daughter's smallness from his son with the gravity it deserved, then went inside and looked at Ruth for a long time with the expression that large things produce in him, the quiet and complete surrender to something bigger than himself. 2, Eudora said. 2, he agreed, sitting down beside her on the bed. I think that might be enough, she said, or at least for now. I think whatever you decide is exactly right, he said, which was the answer she had come to expect from him when the decision was primarily hers to make, and which still managed to please her thoroughly every time he said it. By 1879, Ridgeline was a town of real substance. It had its school and its 2 churches and its mercantile and its hotel, which had been renovated and expanded, and its new doctor, a young man named Abernathy who arrived in the fall of 1878 fresh from his training in New Orleans, and who had the slightly stunned quality of someone who had just discovered what actual medical practice in a frontier town looked like, as opposed to what the textbooks had described. He and Eudora established an immediate and productive working relationship based on her practical accumulated knowledge and his formal training, and he told her within 2 months of his arrival that she had already trained herself past half of what he knew, and that he intended to learn from her as much as she might learn from him. She found this deeply satisfying, and did not say so quite as plainly as she felt it. Raphael married the schoolteacher Clara Hinds in the spring of 1879, after a courtship that had been conducted with a seriousness and sweetness that the whole town had watched with great affection. Eudora stood up with Clara at the wedding, and Timothy stood up with Raphael, and afterward at the celebration, which lasted longer and went later than any of them had planned. She danced with her husband under the paper lanterns that had become something of a Ridgeline tradition, and he held her the way he always held her, close and sure, with the specific warmth of someone who has made a considered and permanent decision and is glad of it every day. Do you remember the first social? He said against her hair. The fiddle player with the 7 songs, she said, in the exact same order every time. He's still playing them in the exact same order, she pointed out. I think it might be a principle. He laughed and held her closer, and she could feel the laugh in his chest, and she closed her eyes and let the music carry them in a slow circle under the lights, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 5 years ago in a cloud of dust with a leather trunk and a dead man's deed, and a snake coiled in the middle of the road, and the man who had moved the snake with a stick and touched his hat to her, and all the distance between that morning and this one, and all the territory they had walked across together. The summer of 1879 was hot even by hill country standards, the kind of heat that gets into the limestone and radiates back out at you after sunset, as though the earth itself has decided to stay warm. The creek that ran between the 2 properties ran lower than it had in the 5 years Eudora had been watching it, and Timothy moved some of his cattle to a pasture in the northwest, where a spring had so far stayed reliable. John, now 4, followed his father around the ranch with the dedicated seriousness of someone in advanced training, asking questions at a rate that would have exhausted most adults, and that Timothy answered with a patience that Eudora sometimes watched from the window with something very large moving in her chest. John had his father's eyes and his mother's directness, and a personality that was somehow entirely his own from the very beginning, certain and curious, and kind in ways that she suspected he would carry all his life. Ruth, not yet 2, was a different creature, entirely quieter, more observant, possessed of a focused attention that made her seem older than she was, with the habit of studying faces with those green eyes until the person being studied became slightly uncomfortable. She would grow into someone formidable, Eudora thought. She looked forward to seeing what kind. On a Thursday evening in late August, with the heat pressing down and the lightning working silently on the horizon to the west, and the smell of rain still hours away, Timothy came in from the ranch and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her in the way that meant he had something to say and was deciding how. She set down the spoon she was using and waited. "Got a letter today," he said. "From my uncle in Colorado. He has a ranch outside Denver, pretty successful. He's getting old and he has no sons. He wants to know if I'd be interested in coming up to take over the operation. Full ownership over time." She was quiet for a moment. The lightning moved on the horizon, silent and patient. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I haven't answered yet," he said. "I wanted to talk to you." She looked at the kitchen around her. The iron stove, the east-facing windows, the limestone walls that she and Raphael and Ernst had watched go up one by one. The medical texts on the shelf beside her father's journals. Outside, she knew without looking, her garden was in the last good weeks of its summer production, and the well was holding, and the live oaks were standing in the northwest corner the way they had been standing when she walked out to survey this land for the first time. "This is my land," she said, quietly but clearly. "I know," he said. "And Ridgeline is, Timothy, this town needs the doctor we helped bring here and the school we helped build and the things we've been part of. And your herd is good. And the children are settled here." She paused. "I don't want to go to Colorado." He nodded slowly. He hadn't moved from the table. The lightning pulsed again, closer now. "I don't want to go either," he said. She looked at him. "You don't?" "I wanted to hear what you thought," he said. "I wanted to make sure it was a decision we were making together, not just one I was making and presenting." He met her eyes. "This is our home. It's been our home for 5 years. I built it with you. I'm not interested in leaving it." She came around the table and stood next to his chair, and he turned toward her and she took his face in both hands, the jaw that she had thought about since the very beginning, and looked at him from very close. "You are a good man, Timothy Keller," she said. "I'm trying to be," he said. "You are," she said, and kissed him. The rain came that night, the first real rain in 6 weeks, and it came with the full dramatic investment that Texas rainstorms bring to the Enterprise: thunder that shook the windows, lightning that turned the dark world white for whole seconds at a time, and then the rain itself, solid and generous, hammering the roof and running in clean rivers off the porch and going down into the limestone country, and finding the water table and replenishing what the summer had taken. They lay in the dark and listened to it, and the children slept through it, and the rain said everything that needed to be said about staying and belonging. He wrote to his uncle the next morning, a kind letter, a grateful letter explaining with sincerity the reasons he was declining. His uncle wrote back 2 weeks later, expressing disappointment but understanding, and adding a line at the end that Timothy read to her over breakfast. "I hope the woman who made you stay is worth staying for, and also that she is worth staying for too." "He means the land," Eudora said. "He does not mean the land," Timothy said. She was definitely not blushing. The autumn of 1879, and the winter that followed it, settled into the good, ordinary texture of a life that has found its proper shape. John started in Clara's school in September, which he approached with the combination of excitement and dignity that characterized his approach to everything new. Ruth began the very early stages of language that are so entertaining and strange, pointing at things with conviction, and naming them in words that were recognizably attempts at the correct word, even when they didn't quite arrive there. Eudora's medical work entered a new phase when Dr. Abernathy, whose confidence in her had been growing steadily, began including her formally in his most complex cases, not as an assistant in the diminishing sense but as a genuine consultant, someone whose observations and judgment he valued and sought. They made a good team, the formally trained young doctor and the self-taught pragmatist, and the town benefited from having both of them. She had begun writing in those months a kind of manual. Not for publication. She had no particular ambition in that direction, but for clarity, for the organizing of what she knew into something transmissible. She wrote about the cases she had seen and how she had approached them, the plant remedies that the older women in the county had shown her, the surgical techniques from her father's journals that she had put into practice. She wrote it at the kitchen table in the evenings after the children were in bed, with the lamp turned up and Timothy reading on the other side of the table, and sometimes he would ask what she was writing and she would read him a passage, and he would listen with the attention she had come to rely on. "You should send this to someone," he said one evening, looking at the growing stack of pages. "I don't know who would want it," she said. "Every frontier town without a doctor," he said simply. She looked at the pages. She thought about all the places that were like Ridgeline had been before she arrived, and before Abernathy places where the nearest physician was 20 or 30 miles away on a road one wanted to travel sick or in labor. She thought about what it would have meant to have something like this in those places, something practical and clear and written by someone who had done the thing rather than only read about it. She sent it the following spring to a medical publication in St. Louis. They wrote back 4 months later saying they intended to publish it as a series of 3 articles, attributed to E. Keller of Ridgeline, Texas, and asking if she had additional material. She had additional material. The day the first article appeared in print, Timothy rode into town and bought the edition at the Mercantile and brought it home and read every word of her article with the studious attention of a man doing the most important reading of his life. And when he finished, he looked up and said, "It's remarkable. It's practical," she said. "That's all." "The best things usually are," he said, and set the journal on the shelf beside her father's medical books. In 1880, the community of Ridgeline gathered to celebrate something that had been building for 6 years, the completion of the new church, a real structure of cut stone and timber with a proper bell tower, replacing the original small wooden building that had served the town since its founding. The celebration took the form of a Sunday service, followed by the largest communal meal the town had ever organized, with tables set up in the street and food contributed by everyone, and the fiddle player whose 7 songs in fixed order had become something of an institution, and dancing that lasted until the stars came out. Eudora stood at the edge of the celebration with Timothy's hand in hers and watched the town around them. Clara and Raphael with their first child, born that spring, a boy they had named Gabriel, Martha Pryor, gray-haired and indestructible, organizing the food tables with the energy of a woman 20 years younger, Dr. Abernathy dancing with the new schoolteacher's sister who had come to visit from Ohio and who had apparently decided to stay. William, Timothy's young ranch hand, now 20 and broad-shouldered, and dancing with a girl named Dora from the German farm family south of town. John, running with a pack of children his age in the way that children run at celebrations, pure and complete joy. Ruth, who was 3 now and sitting on Ernst's knee, old Ernst, who had become something of an honorary grandfather to the family, looking at everything with those green eyes. "Look at what we made," she said. He turned to look at the same scene. "We made a lot of it together." "Not all of it," she said. "Some of it was here before us, some of it will be here after." He looked at her. The stone church bell was visible over the roof line, the new rope hanging from it, the bell they had not yet rung. "Should we ring it?" he said. She looked up at it. "Someone should," she said. He went to find the bell rope, and a minute later the new bell spoke over Ridgeline for the first time, a clear and carrying note that rolled out over the cedar and the limestone and the creek country, over the farms and the ranches and the road east and the road west, and people turned their faces up toward it with the expression of people hearing something promised being kept. When Timothy came back to her, she was standing in the middle of the street with her face turned up and her eyes bright, and he came and stood beside her and she leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and the bell went on ringing in the autumn air, and the children's laughter ran under it like a second song, and the hill country held everything it held, the history and the hardship and the injustice and the beauty, and also this. This particular good thing that two people had built together out of stubbornness and honesty, and the kind of love that shows up and stays. That night, after the children were asleep and the celebration had wound down, and the town had gone quiet in the way that small towns go quiet completely, like a held breath, they sat together on the porch where they had sat on many evenings, on the chairs Timothy had built from cedar the previous winter, and the stars were the enormous Texas stars that never got ordinary no matter how many years you lived under them. "I was thinking today," she said, "about the woman who got off the stagecoach." "With the snake," he said. "With the snake," she agreed. "She was so certain she was going to do this alone." "She was alone when she did the important parts," he said. "I was just the fence." She looked at him. "You were considerably more than the fence." "I was the fence first," he said. "The other things came after." She took his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. Outside, somewhere in the cedars, an owl said its piece about the night. The creek could be heard if you listened. The house around them was warm and solid and smelled of cooking and cedar, and the specific particular smell of lives being lived in it. "I love you," she said. Not for any specific reason or for all of them at once. "I love you," he said, with the same quietness and the same complete weight. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them in, and then they went inside to their life, to the children sleeping and the banked fire and the lamp turned low, and the shelves of books and the papers on the kitchen table, and the iron stove that was always reliable. And they went to bed in the house she had built on her own land in the hill country of Texas. And the night settled over Ridgeline like something careful and generous, and the bell in the new church tower was still. And the creek ran its usual argument through the dark, and everything that needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and the life they had made together out of two separate lives was good entirely, durably, incomprehensibly good. And it would go on being good in all the ways that a life can go on being good when it is made of the right things and lived by people who have learned to deserve it.